The Freedom Junkies presents Breaking Free. I'm Ems Rickson, and this is Breaking Free, the podcast where I talk honestly about addiction, how it has affected me, and the things I do to break free, in the hope it will help others who want to do the same. Hello, welcome to another episode of Breaking Free. I've realised that the last few episodes have all just been me talking, and I thought it was time for another interview episode. And casting around in my mind, trying to figure out who it was that I knew or that I could contact that was also sober that I could interview, I realised that I live with a sober person. And so you're finally going to be introduced to my fellow freedom junkie, Ryan, who is also sober and has agreed to do an interview with us. So hello, Ryan, how are you doing?
Hello, Em.
So you have also been sober for just over a year now. So what was it that made you decide that you wanted to give sobriety a try?
So I feel like I've been trying to stop drinking and smoking at least for many years, really. Over the years, I've tried stopping temporarily, like for a month at a time, which kind of justified it to myself somehow. Most recently, it's just over a year ago, I stopped smoking, drinking and taking Class A's because I noticed a few people around me who were struggling with their addictions to these things, and it kind of like made me see that a little bit in myself. So I thought that it would be a good idea to try and stop, at least not just for a month or a week or a few days, but stop doing these things for the foreseeable future.
So I feel like you and I have quite a different journey towards the same destination. When you're saying that you were always like stopping and starting again, but that you used to have like regular breaks when you were smoking and drinking, that was something that I never did. I always just drank a lot, or I always just smoked a lot, or I just didn't do anything. I was never able to either cut down or moderate or take a break, but feel that I would then be able to start again. So do you feel like, having made a decision that you're now just gonna stop, at least for the foreseeable future, rather than just telling yourself that you're just taking a break, do you think that that has made it easier to sort of stay sober?
I don't think it's necessarily made it easier. It's a different commitment, because before I would just be quite precise with when I would start again. So I'd be like, I'll have a month off and I'll start again on this day, before this party or before this event or whatever. And then obviously I would, and I'd celebrate that. So now that I don't have an end point, I wouldn't say it's easier. I'd actually say it's a bit more difficult not having an end point, at least for me. But that has just shown me how dependent I had become on using drugs and alcohol. I never really had crazy problems, but I don't think I'd ever really learned properly to deal with the world without using a substance of some kind. And so with being sober for the foreseeable future, kind of now I am forced into addressing some of these things which I may have overlooked before.
So one of the things that I feel like you've been learning a lot about this year is about being an introvert, which is something that I feel like maybe you realised around the time that we decided we were going to be sober, and maybe that drugs and alcohol were something that you used to help you relax and interact with people in social situations. So now that you don't have that to rely on, how is it that you manage in those kinds of situations now that you're sober?
Whenever I started looking into the idea of introversion, it was quite an alien topic at the beginning, because I'd only just recognized during this process of going sober finally that what introversion and extroversion were. And so I've studied it quite a lot for the past year or so. It seems like the main thing which differentiates an introvert from an extrovert is that introverts take their energy from within, whereas extroverts take their energy from the outside world. So an introvert generally needs time to recover from social events and lots of people and lots of things happening, whereas an extrovert would thrive on that. So recognizing this has led me to realize my motivations for drinking and taking drugs in the first place. I don't think these things were conscious. I wasn't drinking, out of anxiety or smoking out of anxiety necessarily, but it had become the default way in which I dealt with a social situation. So having recognized the definition of introversion and how that really resonates with me, it's made me well aware of the reasons why I take drugs or have taken drugs and drank a lot, especially in social situations. And so now that I don't have these kind of crutches to rely upon, it's almost like I'm learning from scratch how to be a human. And, like I said, I never had really, really, really crippling problems where I couldn't talk to anyone ever. It just feels a lot more difficult than maybe it would for an extroverted personality type.
Sure, I know now that we're kind of aware of the fact that you're a pretty extreme introvert, we definitely make sure that we keep track of our kind of social engagements and, make sure that we don't schedule too many things in a row, for example. We make sure that if we've decided we're going to do something on this day, then we make sure that we have a break, or if we're going to schedule something else, then I check in with you and say, is this going to be too much? Or, depending on what the activity is or anything like that, we make sure that we have a lot of downtime. The thing that I found really interesting with this whole area that you've started learning about is that I always thought that I was a quite full-on extrovert, and that my drinking and smoking was a kind of extension of that because I was really social and I liked being around people, I was just naturally going to be drinking and smoking and things like that with people. But actually, having done some personality tests, I have found out that actually I'm a highly sensitive ambivert, which means that I'm basically in the middle of the two. So I have some extrovert tendencies and that I enjoy socializing with people, but I find that I do get quite drained by it. And that's something that I didn't know before. So knowing stuff like that about yourself definitely helps you to manage yourself when you're not using substances like alcohol, for example, to essentially manage it for you. I think that a lot of people who maybe are more drained by social situations than they realize use alcohol to push through and to keep on going past the point where they normally would go home and rest. I think I've found that we just don't really go out really anywhere near as much. And what you are interested in doing definitely changes when you become sober over time. So for example, you are a musician and you are in a pretty extreme music scene. How is being sober and also being in a quite heavy party scene, how have those two things kind of meshed for you or not?
Like I said before, I'd been relying on using substances of some kind for most social engagements ever since I can remember. And so this kind of fed into the music scene very predominantly, and I've been playing music live for maybe 10 years. And during that process, obviously, at parties, you're exposed to a hell of a lot of drug culture, and it's very much the social norm and the spiritual sacrament to consume a substance for a party. Stimulants mostly, and psychedelics and weed and alcohol. So having that around has kind of just been very much a norm in the party culture. So now that I've decided not to do that, it's quite an unusual experience because I'm going to events which I would usually at least have a beer at. And now that I don't have these things, in some way there's less of an appeal, and my stamina is like way less. So before I would like take drugs of some kind to stay awake and to communicate easier and to stay on what we call like the vibe of the party, and that really isn't a thing anymore. So it's taken a big part of it out, for better or for worse. During this process though, I've noticed and come across many other people who are in similar situation. It seems to be quite a big thing on the underground level now. There's loads of artists who are stepping away from the drug culture in order to do the music that they enjoy and the things that they enjoy, not as a kind of like, oh, I need to stop for a bit or whatever. It's more of a kind of focus and lifestyle choice. So it doesn't, traditionally it doesn't go hand in hand, being sober, with dance music culture, but there is an emerging wave of people doing this, and it makes it in some ways tolerable or more accessible in some ways, because at least I know when I'm tired now. So if I'm at a party, like if I'm playing a gig at 5 o'clock in the morning, then I'll almost always try and organize that I don't arrive there until like 3 in the morning or something. So then I can actually play with all of my energy, give it everything that I've got, and not be completely annihilated by the time I have to play. So that's changed in many ways, but this has all come from noticing my energy levels and when and where I feel tired, rather than just masking it with drink, weed or ecstasy.
You said something then that I think is quite interesting. I feel like a lot of people definitely associate drugs with creativity. So a lot of people, I know I used to think the same as well. If I wanted to do something creative or something as basic as like drawing a picture or colouring in, because I do love to colour in, that I would smoke a joint before I did it, because it would make me feel more creative and relaxed and all this kind of stuff. Have you found making music and writing music sober to be a similar process to how it was before? Do you think that it has affected your creativity in any way, or do you think that actually now you're more motivated and focused now that you're not smoking?
Yeah, I don't think it's actually affected my creativity in any way necessarily. I think that drugs have a great way of turning on new circuits and activating new parts of the brain and making us think and feel things that we've never before. And I feel like once the circuits are turned on, once you're inspired from these substances, then it's almost like the gateway's open. You don't need to keep that connection going. You don't need to keep taking drugs or drinking or whatever in order to make music inspired by that substance. So in short, I feel like once you've had the message, hang up the phone, like Alan Watts says.
I love that quote. Love Alan Watts. So yeah, he basically said that once you've taken psychedelics, once you've got the information from them that they have to give, similar to being on the phone, once you've taken the message, you don't need to stay on the phone anymore. You can hang up and you still have access to the information, you still have access to the message, which is definitely something that I feel about psychedelics. I think that there's a lot to learn from their safe and respectful use, but that once you have access that kind of information, once it's, like you say, turned on circuits in your brain and really changed the way that you see the world and the way that you think about things, then it's perhaps not necessary to continue to keep using them if it's not something that is kind of working for you anymore. It's not like you will suddenly lose the information that you've gained from them when you stop taking them. I feel like smoking weed, actually, I learned a lot. I learned mostly to just question things, I think. You know, the idea that you're told from a very young age that all drugs are bad and that they're all the same is not true. And when you find that out, you realize that maybe there are other things that you've been told that aren't true, that you can question And I think that's a really important lesson for people to learn. I don't think that you don't necessarily need to smoke weed to learn it, but it was something that taught me a lot for sure, but that I think I stayed on the phone too long, much, much longer than was necessary. I got the message loud and clear, but I didn't hang up. So I think it's a really good metaphor. We're going to say metaphor for sure. Why not? To kind of explain how I think that there are substances that can teach us a lot, but that we don't need to carry on using them to know what we know.
I think it's really difficult to recognise that though, and most of us will just keep smoking or keep drinking as a standard because it becomes associated with the event or the thing that you're doing. So if it's creativity, you know, it might be like, oh, let's make a spliff first before we do anything creative, and then it quite quickly it can become a thing which you are doing out of habit rather than using it for any inspiration or anything particularly stimulating. It can be something that you're doing because you've associated that with creativity, for example. So like going back to what you asked, I don't think that my creativity has changed. I don't think I'm any more or less creative or any more or less innovative now that I'm not using any drugs. But what it has done for me is forced me into a situation to reevaluate my priorities, and as a sober kind of person, and recognize what it is that gives me energy, what it is that I'm interested in, what it is that I value. And all these things have come about from taking myself out of the drug culture.
So what are some of the other benefits that you feel like you're experiencing now that you're sober?
It's really nice not to be coughing constantly. That's a good one, even though we are a bit. It's nice to be able to breathe. Like I kind of, you know, I want to say that I've got a clearer mind, but I'm not sure if I do really. Like I said, I wasn't really having substantial mental health problems or relationship problems that were really crippling from using substances. So for me, it's often really difficult to identify what is better now, because I never went too far into the darkness. So now it's like I almost can't identify what's really positive about stopping. Maybe ask me again in another year or something, and then I might have a clearer idea.
Sure, I think it's one of those things where it can often be quite hard to tell what is happening. I remember when I stopped drinking, I thought that I would be like a completely different person, that I would feel so amazing. And I didn't really feel that different once my like epic last hangover had gone away. I never really felt very different in the moment. I genuinely thought that I would feel like my insides had been like washed out and I would be, you know, like prancing around like a unicorn or something, but I wasn't. Like I did lose a lot of weight, and that did happen quite quickly. So I suppose that was probably like the only visible thing that I could really tell there was anything being affected. But the same with smoking as well, actually. Like physically, I didn't really feel that much different at the beginning, but I feel like a year on, I can definitely notice, and like 10 years on from stopping drinking, I can definitely see big differences and notice like a lot of positive changes. But I think at the time it can be quite hard to see what's happening and to feel any kind of difference. Like, what about any negative aspects of stopping? Is there anything that you miss or that you regret now that you're not drinking or smoking anymore?
Yeah, I think that all of us rely upon something to deal with our lives, and especially darker times or things that we would see as like negative experiences or something. That can be, you know, smoking, drinking, can be shopping, can be sex, can be whatever, to deal with the world. And when you start to chip away at these things and take out the trash, essentially, or the things that you don't really need, you're confronted, or at least I've been confronted with the kind of visceral experience of myself, and having now to recognize and confront the things that happen in my life without turning to a substance to deal with it, because I feel like most of us will often rely on things like this to deal with reality. And I don't think our culture really trains us to deal with the world without using something to cover it up or hide from it. So I guess an example is you have some bad news and you don't know how to deal with it. Often people would be like, you know, traditionally in the old school days, it'd be like, oh, I'm just going to go down the pub and meet my mates. And that would be how culturally many people would have dealt with it. And I have definitely dealt with negative news or things that I can't handle by using substances. I kind of thrived on that, actually. So now there's no kind of like what we can see as like celebratory events through using substances, or, you know, buying a new iPhone or whatever it is that is your fix. Then you're really forced to deal with reality as it comes. And that in itself is kind of like being born again, because you have no choice but to go face to face with the things that are in your way, or the challenges that you face as a human on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, it's funny. I feel like you're actually really quite good at that. I mean, we've just had a stellar example and a perfect opportunity to practice dealing with that kind of stuff, because our van just broke down and we've had to have the engine replaced. And it feels like every day we're getting phone calls from the mechanics telling us that, oh, you're going to need another part. That's another £700. We're up to just over like a $5,000 van bill that we weren't expecting. And I feel like in this whole process, you have been very good at just saying, well, this just has to happen. It just has to happen. So we just have to accept it, not get upset. That's my specialty, is to get quite upset and stressed out. And I feel like you are often the one in these kinds of situations that is really good at just kind of accepting and moving on and trying to find the sort of positives in a quite negative situation. Maybe you're just naturally really good at that. But I feel like you have kind of adapted to the whole idea of, you know, not just knee-jerk reaction, having a beer or smoking a joint when something bad happens, that you have really accepted that this is now how we deal with things, and that of the two of us, you're actually much better at it than I am.
I don't know if I'm better than you at it. I think we have different ways of processing things.
Yes, that's true.
Yeah, I feel like it's a case of figuring out what you can change in certain conditions. You know, like on a bigger scale, like we're born on a physical world with physical rules. There's certain things you can and can't do. We're born into capitalism where, you know, there's certain things that you can and can't do within that. It can be bent, but it can't be broken. And so I always try and like accept the rules as they are if they can't be bent, because there's no point in if you try and change everything about the world all the time, then at least as an introvert, I just have zero energy to deal with a day-to-day life. So I have to put things in boxes of what I can and can't change. And that's kind of, for me anyway, it's been crucial to understanding how I can be happy in the world, really, is deciding in any situation, what is it that I can or can't change about this situation. If I've done my best, then that's all I can do, and you have to then deal with that and focus upon what it can afford you. So the van needing a new engine has made it, as you know, you could see it that we're now trapped in a really posh area in London with not much money, and it's a bit sterile to live in. But you could also see it that we have been like almost like afforded an opportunity. Like, what can we do with this time as we're here? That's why we're making an interview right now. So I think like it's quite common in spiritual texts to talk about the suffering being a positive, and that suffering is inescapable. It's what we do, what we can learn from these events, which is the most important, I think.
So speaking of bending the rules slightly, I suppose we could maybe talk about the van a little bit, because this is quite a new thing for you, I suppose. Like in my wandering years, I have lived and worked, well, I've never converted, but I've lived and travelled in vans before. But this is the first time that you've ever kind of been on like a long trip. We were away for nearly a year, I suppose. And the first time that you've lived in a van, and the first time that we both had done any kind of like van conversion. So how is van life treating you?
I really like it.
That's good.
Yeah. It's like very different from living in a house. It's nice to have time and space and flexibility. You don't have to make tons and tons of money to live in a van. You can, like, I've lived just on the things that I've enjoyed doing, like music and design, and that's pretty rare opportunity these days, I think, for anyone to afford the lifestyle that they live from doing something that they like. And yeah, I mean, our expenses are like super, super low. It's also really nice to live without total security. So there's always, where are we going to get water from today? Where are we going to go to the toilet? Do we have enough money to buy petrol? Stuff like this is, it might sound terrifying if you live in a house where you have all these things all the time, but I think it's actually really involving, and in some ways it's quite nice to think, what are we going to do today? Oh, we really need water. Where are we going to get water from? Let's go to a spring, which is 15 miles away, or something like that. A reorientation around simple values and simple principles has actually been really therapeutic and relaxing. No longer am I like totally focused and obsessed with high achievements, but it's reduced them to achievable, simple goals, which I think is actually quite helpful, especially for an introvert who thinks in lots and lots of levels to everything. So yeah, just kind of like streamlining reality, taking out the things that you don't necessarily need, and living on a lot less is kind of really, really helpful.
Yeah, and I don't know about you, but every kitchen I use now feels enormously inefficient, because so we're staying at my parents' at the moment while we wait for the van to get fixed, and they have a lovely kitchen, but the spoons, for example, are like at the opposite end of the kitchen to where you cook stuff. And having been so used to everything in our kitchen being literally within arm's reach of where you stand, because that's how big our kitchen is, now anything else feels kind of silly to me. Like, I have to walk up and down. I mean, it's not huge, but I still have to move around the kitchen to get stuff. And I feel like I've got so used to living in exactly the amount of space that we need, that now anything else feels really superfluous to requirements. Like, I just feel like I've adapted really well to the space that we've got, and I really enjoy living with just enough. We have 2 bowls, we have 2 plates, we have 2 knives, forks and spoons, because there's 2 of us, and so we only need that much stuff. And that's one of the things I feel like I enjoy the most about it, is that I feel like my life is really pared down to what I need, not everything that is like super functional. Like I definitely have a sewing machine in the van that I've never used, but I will need it one day, so it can stay. I'm not like an extreme minimalist where literally every single thing in there has to have a function or a purpose. And I definitely feel like having like decorative things or making the place look lovely is important to me as well. But definitely, you know, now I feel like we just have the right amount of stuff in the right amount of space, and that's a really satisfying feeling as well. I feel like that's one of my favorite things.
Yeah, I think it's made me realize also how much crap we accumulate as just in our day-to-day kind of Western capitalist lives. Like even if we're not trying to, we'll just accumulate stuff and don't even notice it. Until you have to kind of go through all that and get rid of everything to live in a tiny space, then you realize what it is that you actually need as in your physical environment. And there's not really that much stuff that you really need to eat food and live just as a human. So it's been really nice to kind of like take out the trash and declutter on many levels, not just the body but the mind too.
Yeah, I feel like that it kind of works quite well with the idea of sobriety. I think one of the things that I'm enjoying most about being sober is not having to worry about where we're gonna get weed from, where we're gonna if we're gonna have enough money to buy things, if you know, like we're gonna run out, anything like that. You know, we don't need it, and now it's not a part of my life anymore. I feel like I have a lot more mental space and energy because I'm not constantly thinking about it or trying to find it or whatever. And so like in that way, we've kind of pared our lives down again to what it is that we need. Like, you know, we need food, we need water, but you know, we don't need alcohol and we don't need other substances, as long as we find other ways to deal with the things that we were using them to deal with, for example. But, you know, we've kind of pared down our lives in lots of different areas, and I think that it goes quite well together.
Yeah, definitely. Like, I still, you know, it's not like we don't have like rituals that we do. We still do these things. So like at social events, I would still quite often maybe buy like alcohol-free beer or make some tea or something. It's not like you just take stuff out and don't replace it. I think you have to replace these things that you take out of your life, but it's then becoming like a conscious awareness of like, what is it, if you've taken something out, what is it that you're going to put in replacement?
Sure. I mean, you know, to be fair, in a tiny van we do have an entire shelf for tea, and we have maybe like 8 different kinds of tea. And so now instead of like beer and a doobie, when we watch a film, we have tea and chocolate. And that's like our like movie ritual that has replaced the previously fairly unhealthy one with one that is better for us and also cheaper and easier to fulfill. We definitely still have various different rituals, I suppose. It makes us sound like we're sacrificing babies. We're not doing that. There's no space for that in the van. Is there anything else that you would like to talk about? Any other pearls of wisdom that you have or advice that you have about sobriety, deciding to cut things out?
Maybe we should talk about how many or some people who listen to this or read this kind of stuff might think that sounds all really, really boring and why would you ever do that? And we've felt like that before. I think everyone feels like that when someone says, I'm not going to do this anymore. Then it's like, oh, why not? You're like a party pooper or something. You're not going to partake. I just kind of want to emphasize that the entire reason why we're sober is because we have done that a hell of a lot. And I think that going back to this thing we said before about taking the message from the substance and moving on and doing something with that is really crucial, because it's not that we're stopping. It's not that we're stopping taking drugs and we're stopping like partying until like 6 a.m. and stuff for no reason. We're doing it because we are now focusing on other things, and there is more to life than substances.
Sure, like we have a really exciting plan. If we ever get an engine back in our van and we get back on the road, then we have a super exciting plan to go to Wales to try and find land, to start a land-based community projects with eco houses and permaculture and bees and all kinds of exciting things. And I think that for me, I realized that you only have so much time in the day and you only have so much energy with which to do things. And if you want to achieve something different, if you want to try and change things, then you need all of the energy and all of the time and all of the focus you can get put into this one thing. That's how I felt about the van when we were building it, and that's how I feel about this, that there's something better now. So probably people might feel like our lifestyle is less than thrilling, although there's nothing quite as awesome as a cup of tea and some crochet, unless there's a cat involved. There's no cat yet, but there will be one day. But I think that also your perspective on these things changes. For me now, going to the pub is a draining, exhausting nightmare often that holds very little interest for me anymore. So even if other people think that what you're doing seems like boring and dull, it actually doesn't really bother me anymore, because the things that I used to do previously now hold very little interest for me. I would rather, like you say, be focusing on something more important that feels more worthwhile to me. And I found that I just didn't have the time or the energy or the money to do both. I needed to choose, and I feel like I've made the right choice.
Yeah, it's like a recalibration of life goals, and that I feel like everyone will go through levels of having different goals in their lives. Like maybe it's like an age thing too.
Oh, don't say that.
Maybe.
Are we getting old?
Maybe. Like, you know, when you're like in your 20s, your goals are a lot more outrageous and kind of like over optimistic maybe than they are when you're older. Who knows what it is? But I think that you go through different kind of levels or layers of things that you want to achieve. And, you know, like I've definitely achieved inspiration from drug culture. I've definitely achieved kind of creating something which I really care about through the music stuff, and delivering a message somehow, like my kind of voice to the world. I've definitely like achieved these things. But now it's kind of, for me at least, about taking it to the next level and recognizing where I'm at currently, emotionally and mentally, and working with that rather than against it. And I think that when you are using drugs all the time, or just to kind of deal with your life, then it's very difficult to recognize what is actually happening in your mind, because the brain's very good at tricking itself. For sure. Awesome. Cool. Well, thank you very much for agreeing to be interviewed.
No problem, Ems.
Interviewing an introvert, that's a challenge, gang.
No,
but it was great.
Go and sleep for 2 hours.
And thank you guys so much for listening. And I'm just going to do this because I know how much Ryan loves it when I say this. But bye. All the face he's given me. Bye.
If you enjoyed this podcast, head to Apple Podcasts and leave a rating and review, and subscribe so you never miss an episode. For more information, check out the Freedom Junkies Facebook group and our blog at www.thefreedomjunkies.co.uk. Thanks to Visceral Manifestations for the design, Ryan Swainson for the theme tune, and all of you for listening.